Alright folks, today we're going to be doing a brake rotor and pad change on a 2016 Mazda3 2.5 liter S Grand Touring. So we are going to jump right in. We're going to start with making sure the e-brake on the car is set, which it is. And then we're going to toss the jack up under the main lifting point. Get that car nice up in the air, just so the tire's above the ground. And always for safety, get a jack stand under there. Always give it a shake, make sure she's safe. So normally you would crack your lug nuts beforehand, but I just had this off not too long ago, so they're already pretty loose. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to yank that wheel off, and we'll see what we got inside. Alright, so we just got the tire off, and it didn't last too long before I realized this is definitely going to be at least a one-do job. So we got the stock good. Should be set. What we have is stock rotor, stock pads inside the caliper here. It's a little bit of a rough surface on these. I'm taking a bet that these are stock, like when the car was first sold. This is what came on it. It's got about 60,000 miles on it, so we're gonna swap that up. Step one, we're gonna need to remove the actual caliper, which holds the pads. Then we're gonna get the caliper bracket off so we can get the rotor off, and then we're gonna reverse that process with the new materials. So we're gonna start with the caliper with these. I believe they're a 13 millimeter, but in order to make that easier for us, especially if we need to bust out like a breaker bar or something to get some more torque on there, it's a lot easier if you go ahead and put your car in accessory and then rotate the tire all the way to one side so you have some more access there. We're gonna pop in there. I know I'm not gonna need a whole lot of leverage for these little guys, so I'm just gonna use a smaller ratchet. We're gonna go ahead and break those free, and I'll run them out real quick. Before we rip this caliper out, we're gonna make sure that we get as much stress off the brake line as possible, because this whole brake line area that's inside your wheel well here it's flexible, but you don't want to go putting a whole lot of weight on it or anything like that, because it's not the most durable line. So we're gonna take a flathead screwdriver, and we're gonna pry this retaining clip right on out. Just like that. We're gonna set that aside, and your brake line is going to pop out of the bracket towards you, just like that, and then it slides out through that notch. So we're just gonna take a zip tie, or you can use a bungee cord, or really anything, piece of rope, something like that. I'm gonna pull that caliper right off. I'm gonna use whatever method I've determined, and I like to attach it right to my coil springs, just like that. So that way, I don't have to pull it out of the wheel well. I don't have to worry about it pulling on that line, and there's no need to rebleed brakes or anything like that. Super simple job. Next, we're gonna go ahead and pull the caliper bracket off itself. So we're gonna go ahead and hit these 17 millimeter, because these are set with a little bit more force than those other little tiny bolts. We're gonna stick a breaker bar in there, and you could also use a ratchet with a pipe on the end of it, like this here. Any old pipe will do. Some piece of trash copper pipe you got in your basement, anything like that. We're gonna go ahead and break those free. And it'd be a real long time if we tried to do those the entire way with a breaker bar. So I'm going to swap to a ratchet, which is, now that they're broken free, I don't need a whole lot of force, and I'm just gonna run them out. All right, so I've got those backed out all the way. I'm just gonna pop them out, add them to my pile of fasteners there, and this is just gonna pop right off of that rotor. We're gonna set it aside. We'll be swapping those pads in a minute. My rotor here is real loose because I had it off not too long ago. But if you see, we've got all kind of corrosion on the inside face there, which is gonna get it real stuck onto your hub here. So quick way to bust that off if it's real stuck on there, you wanna hit it with a soft blow. So if all you have is like big meaty metal hammer like this, you wanna go smashing the surface there. So if you take like a 2x4, a chunk of wood or something like that, and when it's on the surface there, hold the wood on it, give it some real good meaty taps on one or two of the sides, and it should pop right off. We're going to set this aside. That's junk, it'll go to the scrapyard. Maybe we can make an extra buck or two. I'm just gonna wipe some of that rust off of there. And before I put the new rotor on, in order to prevent that same situation where you would have a rotor like that stuck to this surface here on the hub, I'm going to put a pretty light coat of anti-seize all over the front surface of it. That up nice. So anti-seize, very simple compound, cheap. You can get it probably at Walmart, but any parts store, like an auto parts store, they'll have plenty of it. I'm going to actually hop in there, and I'm gonna coat first this whole ring here, which the inside of your rotor is gonna make contact with, and then also I'm gonna do my best to coat the entire surface of it so that there's no portion left that can rust will corrode and fix my rotor and my hub surface together. That just makes it a lot easier next time I come in and I'm replacing maybe a hub or a wheel bearing, or maybe I'm putting a new rotor in it. Just makes it easier on me next time I come in here. And while I'm here, I'm also gonna dab just a little bit on these studs, just because they're set with very high torque. So there's really no concern for, or at least I'm not that concerned about on my own personal vehicles, having a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. In my opinion, for my stuff, it just makes it a lot easier to pull those off the next time that I want to pull them off, because if you work on your own cars quite a lot, then you might be removing these, I don't know, multiple times a month maybe sometimes. So easier they are, better it is. Here we've got the actual caliper, and we're gonna go ahead and replace all of the pieces inside here that came with the kit that I bought. I'm gonna start with these bushings, these push pins that guide the whole assembly back and forth. They just yank right out, and they've already got a pretty decent amount of grease on them, so I'm not gonna spend too much time trying to re-grease those. Now these are one way, they're directional. There's a smaller end and a larger end. Larger end goes over this larger piece, the smaller end goes into there. So I'm gonna take the larger side, slide it up towards the top of this, and make sure that it's seated over top of that. And then when I go back in, I also wanna make sure that the other side seats over top of the bottom. If you don't seat these properly, you'll get dust and maybe water inside this system, where this is made to be very smooth back and forth action, because that's how your brake pads are sliding in and out. If that's not smooth, or it seizes up or something like that, you're gonna have a really bad day, because your brakes aren't gonna function like you want them to, and when they're not doing that, you're not slowing down like you need to, and you might have an accident. So same, we've got grease on here. Big end goes towards the outside. Slide that on, make sure it's on there, back in it goes, and make sure the bottom seats as well. Now we're gonna move on to the actual pads. I'm gonna go ahead and push the old ones out. I just have a small flathead screwdriver and give it a bump or two towards the middle. Go from side to side. Oh, good thing we ain't reusing that. Sew your pads out. Flip it around, knock the other side out, same way. That one was a lot easier. Set all that stuff aside. Now we've also got our new retainers. So the same small screwdriver, I'm just gonna get in there and pop those bad boys right out and toss them aside. No longer needed. Repeat on the other side, just like that. And before I go throwing new hardware and stuff in there, I like to grab a wire brush or maybe some sandpaper, something like that. Just clean some of that old brake dust right off of those surfaces, so that all your new components stick in there nice and easy. Clean that up with some compressed air. Same for the other side. Clean it up. I know how these go on here because I've done this at least once before. Reference this video, or maybe the kit that you bought came with instructions or something like that. But these are just gonna slap right on, one on either side. You're gonna wanna make sure that looking in from the side, this surface, at least minimum, are pushed all the way against this here. Otherwise, you're gonna have a lot of trouble fitting your brake pad in here, because it has to fit between these two faces. And if they're too close, brake pad's not gonna fit in. So we're gonna repeat on the other side, just like this. Again, making sure it's seated nice and good. Then you wanna go ahead and you wanna look down it lengthways like this, because what you want to avoid is your rotor is actually gonna be rotating through this area. So you wanna make sure that these tabs aren't too far sideways in either direction, such that they would drag on the surface of the rotor. Because for one, it would vibrate and make a whole lot of noise. So I'm actually just gonna tap that a little bit. They don't have to be perfectly centered, just as long as they're not running through this channel. So the new brake pads are the reverse of the old. We're just gonna set them down inside and push them back like this. When you're going in here, these tabs here are not exactly the same. These have slightly raised portion here, and this one has none. So I like to start on this side, because otherwise you have to hold this down if you come in like this. Whereas if I just push it in this way, then I can push it in with the pad itself. So I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna come all the way up to this side so that it goes in as much an angle as possible, because then it's technically a weensy little bit shorter. Because as you can see from the side, maybe you can see, I hope you can see, what I was talking about a second ago, if this surface here and this surface here are too close together, this pad's not gonna fit between them. And it can actually be quite a challenge to wedge this pad in here because you need to be careful that you are not touching this front surface of the pad with your fingers, because any kind of oils or something you get on there is going to be one more item that your brake pads have to cut through before it's actually making contact with your pad, and that means less stopping power. So I'm going to struggle with this for a minute or two to get her in. Alright, so both sides are in. I'm just gonna go ahead and push them pretty much all the way to the back so that when we go to fit the rotor back inside here, I have as much space as possible. So now the other side, it may be a little bit more challenging because we now have a little bit less space, but we're gonna do the same thing. The pad goes right in the middle and then it's gonna come out. So I'm gonna set it on one side, careful not to touch the surface. And there we go. Again, just gonna push it all the way out and the pads are in. That is all it takes to redo the pads on your brakes. Very simple process. So we're gonna go ahead and begin the reinstallation process because we are done putting in new components. All right, so when you get brand new rotors from anywhere, they normally come shipped with some kind of coating on them, like a thin oil or something like that, just to prevent corrosion and rust during shipping. Again, that's something that you don't want between your brake pads and your rotor surface because it's going to reduce the friction, which means you stop in a lot less time. So grab yourself some brake clean. It's pretty powerful stuff. You don't want to get it on any kind of painted surfaces, or if you get it on your hands, wash it off. It'll irritate skin, it'll dry skin out because it dries really quick. But go ahead and just give all the flat surfaces that are going to make contact with your pads, which is these areas on both sides. Nice quick spray down. Any of the other areas, like this front surface or these side fins or anything like that, not much of a concern because they're not what's making contact with your pads. So I'm going to give this a second or two to dry off before I stick it back on the car. We're going to slap our rotor back in place, or our new rotor. He's on there nice, loose, not tightened down yet. Next, we're going to slap this on there. It's gonna go, we got as much space as we could between these, so it's gonna ride on pretty easy. I'm gonna kind of just temp set that there for a second. I'm gonna go back to my hardware real quick, just clean those threads up, and I'm gonna apply just a dab of Thread Locker Red, which is a type of glue, more or less, that you apply to threads of a bolt so that vibrations and such don't cause it to back out, which would be a severe problem if your brakes started falling apart. And the reason I'm using red, which is a very strong one, is because there were remnants of red level from the manufacturing spec. So I'm just doing my best to follow that. Whether you use blue, red, or none at all, that is completely up to you. But aligning this, I like to actually pull the rotor and the caliper bracket a little bit further away so that I can stick the bolt through some, and it just makes it a little bit easier to align it then with the actual bracket. And this whole time you want to be mindful that you're not grabbing a nice fistful of rotor or something like that and smearing up that nice surface that we just cleaned off. So I've got that top one in there. I'm gonna go ahead, prepare the second one, same as I did, clean it off, get some thread locker on there, and get it in there. Just a little bit of prep before we do the rest of it. We had spaced these pads about as far out as we could, so that it would be easier to slap that on top of the rotor. But now we're gonna try to squeeze the caliper back on top of these. So we actually want them to be as small as possible. So I'm just gonna grab them and squeeze them toward each other so that it's as thin as possible in there. Now, whenever you apply new pads or something like that, you ought to get like a little packet of grease, like that, covered in dog hair, of course. And you're meant to apply this to a few areas, like these greased areas that we had before, but I had plenty of grease there. And then also, they tell you to coat the entire back of your pad, but I already used like a butt ton of this stuff on the other side. So I don't have a whole lot of it left. And a decent way to preserve what is left is when you bring your caliper back down, whether you zip tied it or bungee corded or whatever, you can apply it just to the surface of the piston and then the surface of these tongues that make contact with these. So you get the grease where it's making contact with the actual caliper parts, but you don't have to coat everything in grease. So in order to actually fit these new thicker pads, because there's more life on them, inside this distance was the distance of the old pads, which don't have near as much life in them. They're just not as thick. So there's probably some kind of real fancy tool that you could buy that could do that, but we're all about doing things on a budget here. So we just have a little, looks like 6-inch C-clamp, which I'm gonna set it on the piston and some hard surface on the back of my caliper here. Oh dear, don't do that. And bear in mind, you're not gonna wanna set this on top of like your banjo bolt here or any of these connections, because that's the last thing that you wanna blow out. We're gonna go ahead and we're just gonna tighten this down. It's not super stiff or anything like that, but you wouldn't want to do it with your bare hands. That's why we use the clamp. And you can see this piston's being pushed back up inside this cylinder here. We're just gonna smush that down, get us some more space. And then next time we get in the car and we push on the brake pedal, that'll push right back out to where it needs to be. So I'm gonna loosen that up, and I'm gonna go ahead, I'm actually gonna clean these surfaces up a little bit, at least. Try not to put a hole in that grommet covering there. Clean that up, and I'm gonna use what grease I have left to coat some of that, which there's not a whole lot left because, like I said, I used most of it on the other side, but there's some. Just be mindful, of course, when you're moving this caliper around, that you're not putting too much stress on the brake line back here. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna use this to smear this grease around and just make sure that we've coated all these contact areas. They have you do this to reduce squeal and chatter inside your brakes, which translates to some pretty nasty noise in real life that, one, if it doesn't give you a heart attack about your car possibly falling apart, is going to annoy you a lot, and also your neighbors and anyone who's beside you on the road. So we now have this ready to go back in. We have enough space. We have our grease in the right place. All we're gonna do is slide that right on top of our new pads. And we're gonna go ahead and grab our hardware. I'm gonna dab a little bit of Loctite Blue on these boys. Again, just to make sure they're not gonna back out on me. And Loctite Blue is a less strong seal than Loctite Red. And these are just little tiny bolts. If I put red Loctite on there and then I tried to bust them out with a breaker bar or something in the future, I would most certainly snap one in half. So we're gonna line this up. And so this bolt here is driving into this pin that we had removed earlier, and the pin can rotate freely. That's why there's this nut looking piece on it here. That's not lined up too well. So if it's just refusing to go on easy and it's rotating a whole lot on you, you can always grab a crescent wrench or something, maybe just a regular open-ended combo wrench, and slap it on there. Most of the time you can get by without it. I'm gonna go ahead and set both sides, because if the caliper's in the right place, then it's just gonna go on easier. I'm gonna grab a ratchet, again with a 13mm on there, and I'm gonna drive these home. And it looks like I might need something to hold that with. I'm going to grab my Leatherman, and kind of wrench or something will do. Hold that. Once that's tight enough, you don't need to hold it anymore. We'll torque that down properly in another minute. This side's going in pretty easy. I don't need to hold it in place with the pliers. Good to go. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and reattach the brake line from this little tube, this little intermediate bracket that it was on with this retaining clip. And if you see, it's got a flat on one side here, the rest of it's round. And that actually fits into this in one direction. Slide that in, make sure it's lined up properly. Set this little retaining clip, and I find that something a little bit softer, like maybe a wooden handle to your hammer, just tap that into place, just like that. We are ready for our tire to go back on, but before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and, while I'm removing my trouble light or flashlight or phone, whatever you're using to light up your workspace, I'm going to go ahead and just check that my brake fitting is good, and any other connections I have, like this is the top trim level, so it's got all the ABS connections and stuff like that. I'm not sure if the base models will have that, and you want to make sure that those are all routed properly and not running into anything that's going to be rotating or anything like that. I'm going to go ahead, hop back in the car and straighten the wheel out, and we'll mount that tire back. On she goes. I'm gonna go ahead and set the lug nuts one by one, and then we're gonna give it the standard star pattern torque. All right, those are all finger tight, so I'm gonna set it down on the ground before final torquing. Put my jack up a little bit, pull my jack post out, and bring her down. We'll finalize these. And we're good to go. Thanks for watching.